Well, welcome. My name is Scott Engelman, and we are here this morning to give hope and direction through the teaching of God's Word. How many of you have seen that film that clip was taken from? Anybody? Wow. It's taken from a film called Nefarious, and a great film. And the whole premise behind it is the guy in the prison garb is going to be killed later that night in the electric chair. But they send this atheist psychiatrist in order to do a last-minute psych evaluation to see if they can withhold the electric chair based on him being insane. And so it's a conversation, really the whole film is a conversation between the psychiatrist and the guy who's demon-possessed. And if you haven't seen it, it really is a great film to watch, very accurate in terms of how things really are. But what I want to do in using that, to jump from that, and springboard from that, is what do you think of when you hear the term spiritual battle? What do you think of when you hear that term? Do you think of something like the demon-possessed guy? What do you think of? Anybody? We've heard that term. We talk about it. There's songs about it. What is the spiritual battle that we as believers, as Christian men, are engaged in? Anybody? Okay, the fight against temptation. Okay.
Battle between good and evil.
Pardon me?
The
The battle between good and evil. Okay.
fight between the inside and the outside.
Fight between the inside, the flesh, the outside, the spirit. Okay.
Spiritual wickedness in high places.
Spiritual wickedness in high places. Yeah, all of that is all part of it, isn't it? And we hear about that, we read about it, we talk about it. But what I want to know is this: is there more to the spiritual battle than just demon possession and the breaking down of spiritual strongholds? Because usually when you think about the spiritual battle, that's the kind of stuff you think about, isn't it? But is there more to the spiritual battle than that? Is there more to the spiritual battle that we are facing every day that we are unaware of? Well, that brings us to our current series, Hidden Fire, Navigating Sexual Passion for the Glory of God. And we've been going, I think this is our third session on this series. And the reason that we decided to do this series is 4 reasons. First, God created you and I as men as sexual beings with powerful sexual passions and desires living deep inside us. They're like a fire, powerful passions, powerful desires inside of us. And they can be good, they can be bad, they can move things in a good way, they can move things in a really bad way. They're powerful. And because they're so powerful, we are often afraid of them. They're there, but they're oftentimes uncontrollable. And so we kind of are afraid of those passions. Second reason is the culture that we live in is hyper-focused on sexual passion and desire. So not only are we kind of afraid of these things because they're so big and powerful, like have you ever walked, have you ever been in the presence of a tornado walking by? It's kind of like, wow, but it's so big and powerful, it draws you, but yet it scares you to death. That's kind of what sexual passion is like. It draws you, but it scares you because it's so big and powerful. And yet our culture today is consumed with it. And as a result, we are consumed with them. We're afraid of them. We're consumed by them. We don't know what to do with them. Third, God calls you and I as men to use the sexual passions that He has created within us for His glory and for the good of others. In other words, my sexual passion isn't just for me, it's for the glory of God and the good of others. Sexual passion is what energizes who we are as a man or a woman. We have masculine sexual passion, whereas a woman has feminine sexual passion. And that animates us and that drives us as men to do good or to do bad. But so often today, because we're afraid of them, because we're wrongly consumed by them, by our culture, we often misuse them. And then the fourth reason we want to do this, Mark kind of talked about this a bit, is the church is too ashamed to talk about what God was not ashamed to create. God wasn't ashamed to create who we are as men, as sexual beings, but for some reason we in the church today are fearful to talk about it. And as a result, guess what happens, guys? We are isolated as men. We are alone in all of these passions that are big and powerful, and they are inviting, and yet they're dangerous, and we're consumed by them, and we misuse them, and we don't know what to do with them because we're alone. We have no one to talk with about them. So based on those four reasons, we want to begin to address these. Now, as a result of all of this, as Christian men, we live exhausted, lonely lives when it comes to our sexual passions, working hard to manage them in some kind of acceptable way, acceptable because some ways we think are acceptable are different than what other men might say. But whatever it is, there's always a way that we think are acceptable and non-acceptable. And so we're trying to find a way to manage these things that seem uncontrollable. Until, and maybe we can do it until something happens. We see something, some woman says something to us, whatever it is, and those passions are triggered. And all of a sudden, like a flame, they come alive, they burst into existence. They come out from underneath the surface and they come into our lives. And we end up doing things we regret, we end up doing things that are destructive and hurtful. And then when that happens, what do? We try to find a way to bring them back under control, to control them, to subdue them once again to our own will and our own sense of management. And once we're able to do that again, we get on with life. But where do we go? We go back to living as Christian men, exhausted lives, working hard to manage these passions in a way that's acceptable. And you see what happens, guys? You see the cycle here? There's a cycle that we all get stuck in, this sexual cycle of exhaustion, failure, and shame. Exhaustion, failure, and shame. And so in light of that, the purpose of our series, why I'm sharing this and why I think it's so important that we think about these things, is so that we can learn to break free from this sexual cycle that is so destructive by finding a better way to navigate our sexual passions in a way that will bring glory to God, in a way that will bring blessing to others, and in a way that will bring rest and peace and freedom to our own souls. You see, your passion and my sexual passion was made to bring glory to God. It wasn't made to dishonor God. Your sexual passion and your sexual desire was made to bring blessing to others. It is to animate you to move into chaos and to do things that will bless others. And your sexual passion was made to be a good thing for you, a thing that gives you peace and freedom and joy, a sense of life, instead of a thing of shame and guilt. And so, in light of all of that, some of the topics that we are going to be talking about in the next months to come, getting to the heart of lust. We're going to talk about that. What is lust? And how does it seek to overpower us, and how do we deal with it? What do I do when I mess up? If you mess up, does it mean it's over? What do I do when I mess up sexually? Third, affair-proofing your marriage. What do I need to do so I don't mess up? I don't want to mess up, so what do I do? Is there some things that I can begin to do to affair-proof my marriage? Next, supermarital sex. So what is sex as God created it to look like? How does this sexual passion to be manifest in the bedroom with my wife? That's an important thing to talk about. There's a whole book that talks about it we're going to look at. Sex and the single guy. I'm not married. I don't have a wife. So what do I do? Then lastly, navigating the path of sexual integrity. We want to bring it all together and say, okay, what have we learned and what does this mean for us today as men? So that's where we're going to be going, but where we left off last time and where we want to pick up again today is this whole area of sexual temptation. Because sexual temptation is where all this starts, isn't it? We don't get into lust, we don't have affairs, we don't get into porn, all that without first being tempted sexually. So the question is, what in the world is sexual temptation? And if you were here last time, we gave a definition of it. We looked at the scriptures, and from everything we looked at, we put it into a sentence, and here's our definition. Sexual temptation can be defined as a poisonous spiritual arrow that is aimed at subverting our heart's devotion to God, inflaming the sexual desires and passions within our body, and it uses seductive, satanic lies to do it. So it's a poisonous spiritual arrow. It's not just a biological thing, it's a spiritual thing. It's part of the battle that we're involved in. And it's aimed at subverting our heart's devotion to God. In other words, it's not just aimed at causing us to mess up. That's a byproduct. But what it's aimed at is your heart. And specifically, the devotion of your heart that was meant for God. It seeks to corrupt that. It seeks to diminish that. It seeks to destroy that. How? By inflaming something that we feel very powerfully in our own bodies. Our sexual passions. It inflames it. And how does it do it? It uses seductive, satanic lies. Lies like, you deserve to feel good. You've been feeling kind of bad lately. You deserve to feel good. Or it's just a harmless fantasy. Can't hurt anybody. Doesn't mean anything. Or everyone's doing it. No big deal. Or it's not as bad as what Joe is doing. Or your wife isn't meeting your needs. You deserve to have your needs met. She's not meeting your needs, so have your needs met. No one will find out. And this is the one that I've heard a lot. God understands. He understands what you're going through. He understands. And He wants you to feel good. He wants you to have relief. He wants you to feel happy. I mean, there are tons more of these, aren't there, guys? And when you're on the edge, it doesn't take much of a lie to kind of push you over to say, okay, here we go. So, sexual temptation, a poisonous spiritual arrow that's aimed at subverting your heart's devotion to God by inflaming the sexual desires in your body, legitimate sexual desires, using seductive, satanic lies so that you use them in illegitimate ways. We also, last time, discovered that while sexual temptation is not sin, just because you're tempted sexually, it doesn't mean you've fallen into sin. It really is just a doorway that invites you into sin. You have to make the choice to open the door and walk in. But just having the door put before you is not sin. And that's what sexual temptation is. It is the spiritual forces of darkness whispering before you and putting a door in front of you to say, you can walk through that door and really feel good. But we got to make the choice. And when we make the choice to walk through that door, we've moved past temptation. And as the Bible talks about it, we've fallen into temptation. We've fallen into sin. Second, we also discovered that while sexual temptation is biological in nature, we feel it in our bodies, it is spiritual in origin. It's not just coming from our bodies, it's coming from another realm. And then thirdly, because sexual temptation is spiritual in origin, it must be confronted in the context of spiritual battle. It's an arrow coming from another realm that targets our own physical being in this realm, but it's part of this battle that's going on between the seen realm and the unseen realm. And if we're going to understand it, and if we're going to confront it and deal with it in a way that we're able to defeat it, we can't ignore that it's coming to us in this spiritual battle. So then, question, what is this spiritual battle? Is it just demonic possession and breaking down strongholds, or is it more than that? That's what we want to deal with today. And so we concluded, if we are to confront the spiritual battle or temptation from the context of spiritual battle, again, what is it? What is it? So today's topic, sexual temptation part 2, confronting Satan's arrows on the spiritual battlefield. Because they're going to be coming at you. And they're going to be coming at you every day because we live in a culture and we have technology that invites us to constantly be sexually tempted. And when it comes at you today and tomorrow and this week, you have to understand the spiritual battle in it, because if you don't, you are going to be much more open to taking an arrow in your heart. So, what is the spiritual battlefield that we're on? Probably the most familiar text that we think of when we think of the spiritual battle is Ephesians 6, right? Everybody know it? Paul says in verse 11, put on all the armor of God, so that you will be able to do what? Stand firm against what? All the strategies of the devil. For we are not in a battle against flesh and blood enemies, but against evil rulers, against authorities of the unseen world, against mighty powers in this dark world, against evil spirits in the heavenly places. Two observations from this text. First, notice Paul is saying that we are currently entangled in a cosmic battle that's driven by evil spiritual forces that have seized humanity's rightful authority over the world. The phrases that Paul talks about, principalities, powers, all that, they specifically deal with dark, evil, unseen forces that rule over certain domains. So this spiritual darkness, these spiritual entities that are evil and wicked, they rule the world really in our place. They've usurped the authority of humanity, because when God created us as image bearers, He gave us the right to have authority over the world. We were to go and subdue it. When we fell into sin, guess what we gave up? Our authority to rule the world. Guess who took that authority? Guess who usurped that authority? These evil forces. So he says we're currently entangled in this cosmic battle. And he says as we're entangled in this, we're called to engage this battle using strategies and weapons drawn from the spiritual realm and not from the human realm. In other words, as we engage the battle, there are ways to engage it that will be successful in fighting the battle, and there are ways to engage it that won't help in fighting the battle. And Paul says if you're going to be successful in the battle, you have to deal with it in the terms of spiritual strategies and spiritual weapons, not using human or this world, this realm's strategies and weapons. And so the question that we have to ask, if that's true, what are these spiritual strategies and weapons to be used in the spiritual battle when it comes to sexual temptation? Because what Paul is saying is if we're going to be successful with sexual temptation, we can't use strategies and weapons that our world would normally to defeat sexual temptation. We have to use strategies and weapons that come from a different place. the spiritual realm. So what are they? So in light of that question, here's my thesis for today. This is what I want to prove. This is what I'm going to show you. To grasp the essence of spiritual strategies and weapons that we're to use in fighting the battle against sexual temptation, we must first understand the nature of the spiritual battle in which they are used. Here are the weapons, here are the strategies, but they're used in the spiritual battle. What is that spiritual battle like? And then secondly, to understand the nature of the spiritual battle, we must first know God's larger story in which the spiritual battle is being fought. In other words, there's a large story going on. And in this story, in this narrative, we find the spiritual battle. And in the spiritual battle, we learn about the spiritual weapons and the spiritual resources and strategies that we're to use. So if we're going to understand all of this, if we're going to be successful in sexual temptation, we got to ultimately understand the story that we're living in. And the story that our culture tells us we're living in is a very different story than the story God tells us we're living in. So what is that story? We need to know God's story to understand this battle. It explains the battle's origin, combatants, location, dynamics, and strategies and weapons. So what's the story? Well, we can go in a lot of different directions, but let me just do this. It's a simple overview. God's story, as told in the Bible, can be told through 4 movements in world history. God's story is about world history. God's story is the writing out, the telling of human history. And it has 4 movements. First, pre-creation. Second movement is creation. The third movement is decreation. And the fourth movement, which reaches history's goal, is recreation. So pre-creation, creation, decreation, recreation. Those are the 4 movements of God's story. Now, when it comes to the pre-creation, Genesis 1, verses 1 and 2, we see that God is overlooking this dark, chaotic place. And God, in essence, we see in chapter 1, he wants a family. And he wants a human family to love and share his life with them. And as he overlooks this and he's going to create a material world, he sees all this and it is chaotic, darkness, and desolation. It's not an environment where a human family could exist. It's called anti-shalom. Not the way it's supposed to be is a good way of understanding it. And so because God wants a human family to love and care for, what does God do? Well, Genesis 1, verses 3 all the way through chapter 2, God creates a good world. A world of order, beauty, and life. And in that place of order, beauty, and life, he then creates a man out of the dust and a woman out of the man's rib. And he brings them together in marriage and he says, populate, fill the earth, and be part of my family. I've given you all of this for you to enjoy, for you to rule over, for you to represent me in, and what we're going to do, we're going to live in this place called Eden where you're going to walk with me and you can enjoy life with me, and then you're going to go out into the world and to subdue it and work and to take Eden and really expand Eden. That's what God wanted us, that's what we were about. And he wanted a family to share that with. That's called shalom. Now, just a little side note. Did God create us because he was lonely and he needed someone to love? No. God, first of all, he had his spiritual family that he had created, the angels, but he also had another family, the Trinity. And that Trinity was an eternal family. God had always been in a loving, mutually loving, caring relationship, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. And so God creates us out of an abundance of love. God creates us because he loves a relationship. And he created us for a relationship with him, relationship with each other, and relationship with his creation. And he says it was very good. Then comes the decreation of God's good creation. Chapter 3 of Genesis. And we see that really going all the way over to Revelation chapter 20. When God creates, we see in chapter 3 of Genesis, man rebels. He rebels by eating of the fruit. He rebels in chapter 6 with the coming together of the sons of God, the angels and the human beings, and creates a corrupted race. And then in chapter 11 of Genesis, we have the creation of the Tower of Babel and the whole idea of idolatry. And God then separates them and he creates the nations. But those three rebellions create three things. Sin and death in the world, brings sin and death in the world, Genesis 3. It brings disorder and depravity to the world, Genesis 6. And it brings idolatry and slavery. Slavery not only to sin, but slavery to these fallen beings that we discussed in Ephesians 6. And we see from Genesis 11 all the way through to Revelation 20 that the fruit of that rebellion being played out. And that's called anti-shalom again. Not the way it's supposed to be. And then we come to the recreation, history's goal, where everything is heading. Where everything in this world is heading. We see in Matthew 1 all the way through Revelation 22, God restores his human family through Christ. And he restores us to live together once again with him in this new earth. In other words, God comes back to earth, and as he comes back to earth, we walk with him and we live with him. And there is restored order, there is refreshed beauty, there is resurrected life, no longer death. And we no longer have just shalom, we have completed shalom. It's always going to be the way it's supposed to be. Now that's the story in 4 movements. And what I want you to see is the context of the spiritual battle happens in the last 2 movements, in the decreation and in the recreation. Okay? Notice the decreation, Genesis 3 through Revelation 20, is described throughout the New Testament as this present evil age. That's how it is described. We live in an age that is described in the Scripture specifically as this present evil age. That's the decreation. But in the recreation, in that 4th movement, it's described in a different way. It's described as the promised new age, or the new creation, the age to come. So you have these 2 ages. The present evil age, which is connected to Genesis 3 through Revelation 20, and the promised new age, which is connected to Matthew 1 all the way through Revelation 22. Now, what I want you to see is, as Christian men, you and I are currently living in both ages. The present evil age and the promised new age. You say, well, how could this be? Well, I want you to notice something. Notice Genesis 3 through Revelation 20. When you look at the recreation, it doesn't start with Revelation 21 through 22. It starts where? In Matthew 1, with the coming of the promised Messiah. In other words, what I want you to see is there's an overlap of time. You see that? There's an overlap of the present evil age and the promised new age. Now, let me give you a closer look at this overlap because it's so important, because the whole New Testament operates out of this way of thinking in terms of time. We have the present evil age, which is described throughout the New Testament as it's under Satan's authority. It's disinherit, where the people in it are disinherited from God. They're no longer part of God's family because of sin. We're described as being in Adam, and being in Adam is associated with death. It's an age where everything is animated by the flesh, and the flesh really is a virus that causes us to have an allergy towards God. We're always, I don't like God. It's characterized by the desires and deeds of this allergy, the flesh. It's described as we're enslaved to sin. We are spiritually unresponsive, even though what I want to do, I can't do because I am spiritually dead in sin. It's a subhuman state. It's called the old self. We're not the way we're supposed to be as men, created to reflect God. And this present evil age is also described as the kingdom of darkness. That's the present evil age in which we live. Now, it began at the fall and it ends in Revelation 20 when Jesus comes again. And when he comes again at his second coming, Satan is disempowered and he's cast into hell. There is the great white throne judgment where evil and death are thrown into hell and destroyed. And the New Jerusalem comes down from heaven and comes back to earth. It's God's presence coming back to earth, and all things are made new. In fact, the New Jerusalem is just an expanded form of Eden. Eden returns, and all things are made new the way they're supposed to be. That's how it's going to happen. But that's the present new age. The second age, the promised new age. How is that characterized? Well, it's characterized by being under Jesus' authority. We are no longer disinherited from God, but those who place faith in Jesus are adopted by God back into his family. We are not in Adam, we're in Christ, and there is life. We're animated not by the flesh, but by the Spirit, that which draws us to God, as opposed to repels us from God. It's characterized by the desires and fruit of the Spirit. We're enslaved to righteousness, not sin. We're spiritually responsive, not unresponsive. We're fully human, not subhuman. It's called the new self as opposed to the old self. And finally, it's part of the kingdom of God and not just the kingdom of God. It's in the overlap of the present evil age and the promised new age that we now live, that we now proclaim the message. It's the already but not yet. Have you heard of that term? The already but not yet? Notice, the already but not yet. Satan has been dethroned but not yet been disempowered or cast into hell. See that? The new age has been inaugurated through the resurrection of Christ, but there is still evil and death yet to be destroyed. Christ has ascended and the Spirit has been given and his rule has begun, but the New Jerusalem has not descended and all things have not yet been made right. The already but not yet. That's the context of the spiritual battle. It's in the overlap of the ages that we are fighting this battle. And it's the overlap of the ages in which we are confronting on a daily basis the arrows of sexual temptation. And if temptation was just a biological thing, no big deal. But if it really is a spiritual arrow with spiritual origin launched at our hearts by the forces of darkness, then it's important we understand the context of this battle. What is this battle? Let's apply it in a way that now kind of brings us home to sexual temptation. Let's apply the overlap to Galatians 5:16. Galatians 5:16, Paul says, "So I say, walk by the Spirit, and you will not gratify the desires of the flesh." You see the two ages here? The Spirit is the what? Promised new age. And gratify the desires of what? The flesh, which is what? Part of the present evil age. For the flesh desires what is contrary to the Spirit, and the Spirit desires what is contrary to the flesh. What do you see there? There's a battle going on. And the battle has to do with desire, fleshly desire and spirit desire. And it's taking place in the overlap. Now, Paul goes on a few verses later in Galatians 5:20 through 21. He describes the desires and the deeds of the flesh. You know what's interesting? Most all of them revolve, well, really, they all revolve in some way. They're linked to what? Sexual immorality. He says, here are the desires of the deeds of the flesh: sexual immorality, sexual impurity, sexual debauchery. It's all included in those words. Idolatry and witchcraft. Why idolatry and witchcraft? Because guess what is associated with idolatry and witchcraft? Sexual immorality, sexual impurity, sexual idolatry. Hatred, discord, jealousy, fits of rage, selfish ambition, dissensions, factions, and envy, drunkenness, and sexual orgies. Guys, all of this is associated with sexual corruption, not the way our sexual passions are to be extended. On the other hand, he says in verses 22 and 26 through 26 of Galatians 5, there are the desires and fruit of the Spirit. And notice the difference: love, joy, peace, forbearance, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. And he goes on. These are all things where there's order and beauty in life, the way they're supposed to be. He doesn't talk about sexual immorality here because sexual passion, when there's order, beauty in life, is going to be always used in what kind of ways? In legitimate, life-giving, purposefully created ways that brings honor to God, blessing to others, and joy and rest in our souls. So on the one hand, the desires and deeds of the flesh are the present evil age, the kingdom of darkness. On the other hand, the desires and fruit of the Spirit is the promised new age, the kingdom of God. And guys, that's the overlap of the ages that we're living in when it comes to this whole thing of sexual immorality. That's where the spiritual battle lies. That's where the arrows penetrate. The desires and deeds of the flesh that are fighting against the desires and fruit of the Spirit. And it's a battle. Each age is battling for your heart and for my heart and for the passions that God has placed in my heart that cause me to move and act and motivate me to live as a man. They're fighting for the things that my heart loves and that my heart desires. The loves and desires that God has legitimately put there. And we fight the spiritual battle, the New Testament says, by putting off the new self, putting on the new self that is related to the promised new age with its desires and fruit, and doing what with the old? Putting off the old self that is connected with the desires and deeds of the flesh. That's what's going on, whether we realize it or not. And what's happening then is Satan shoots those poisonous spiritual arrows of sexual temptation. And guess what they're intended to do? To pull you away from the coming new age and to pull you back where? Into the present evil age. And the way it does it is by infecting with its poison our hearts, passions and desires and loves. In other words, what I want you to see is sexual temptation is a poisonous spiritual arrow that targets our heart's devotion to God used by Satan in the spiritual battle being fought in the overlap of the ages. That's what the spiritual battle involves, that we're involved in every day. Its goal is to prevent our hearts from leaning into the good desires of God's promised new age inaugurated by Jesus' resurrection. You know, when Jesus rose from the dead, everything in the world changed. History changed. The new creation began, and we're part of that. But we're still in this decreation state, this present evil age. And the goal is to prevent our hearts from leaning into that age, the good age. How? By keeping our heart's passions directed back toward the desires of this present evil age. I want to make an observation in light of all of that. I want us to think now about how it is that we are told as Christian men to deal with sexual temptation. Okay? Given the overlap of the ages. If you look at most Christian books that deal with sexual temptation or sexual purity, most of those books have reduced a man's battle with sexual temptation to merely a biological struggle that you need to pray about. Okay? What's the result of just looking at it as a biological struggle? What's the result, guys? Failure, yeah. Too many Christian men deal with sexual temptation from a behavior management approach that asks the one single question, and what is it? What do I do to manage sexual temptation? What do I got to do to stop this? What do I got to do to keep me from giving into this? And some of the answers that you'll get from these books are, you got to bounce your eyes. You know, you see something, bounce them. You got to exhaust your body, because if you're exhausted, guess what you won't feel? You won't feel sexual temptation, because you'll burn all that energy out of you. So exercise more, guys. Take a cold shower. Shame yourself. I'm so bad for even wanting to think this. You know, how can I even be a Christian? That'll get you to stop, won't it? Now, all but the last one might be helpful, but if that's your only approach to dealing with sexual temptation from a biological sin management perspective, how's that working? It doesn't. So here's my question. What is fundamentally wrong with this approach? If you take the Bible seriously, if you take yourself as a Christian made in the image of God and God working in you to make you like Jesus, if you take all that seriously, what's wrong with this approach? First of all, it ignores something. It ignores the spiritual battle presently going on in the overlap of the ages that targets our heart's devotion to God. You see, if you only think of spiritual battle like we saw in the clip as demon possession and breaking down strongholds and burning Ouija boards and tarot cards, if that's the only way you think of the spiritual battle, then you're not going to even begin to think about it in this way. You're going to ignore it. Well, I'm not dealing with demon possession. I'm not dealing with tarot cards. I'm just dealing with plain old sexual temptation. And you ignore the battle. Primarily because we don't really understand the battle. And secondly, it reduces our battle with sexual temptation to simply a matter of managing our body's sexual appetites and behavior. And it's much more than that. Much more than that. And a third thing that it does is it overlooks how God has designed us to function as human beings made in his image. And this is core and key and important to understand. How has God made us to function as men who have been made in his image? How has he made us to function? Well, we'll answer that question when we come back from our 5-minute break, okay? So 10 o'clock, we'll get started again, guys. All right, welcome back. Prior to the break, we made the observation, we said too often the typical approach that we are given as Christian men to dealing with sexual temptation is a behavior management approach that asks the basic, simple one question: tell me what I can do to manage my sexual temptation. Tell me what I can do to control it so it doesn't impact me. Just tell me what to do. What are the things I can do to fix this? Bounce your eyes, exhaust your body, take a cold shower, and shame yourself are some of the things that you can learn from some of these books. And again, there's some things that are helpful, but we said that there are 3 things fundamentally wrong if that's the only thing you do, that behavior management approach to dealing with sexual temptation. First, it ignores the spiritual battle presently going on in the overlap of the ages that triggers our heart's devotion to God, this present evil age and the promised age to come that we are currently living in both. Second, it reduces our battle with sexual temptation to simply a matter of managing our body's sexual appetites and behavior. Just stop that and do this. And it just becomes a matter of gutting it out in the will. And then thirdly, we said it overlooks God's design, how God designed us to function as human beings made in the image of God. And I said this is key to understanding a lot of this, all of this. And we said, well, then how has God made us to function? Well, what do I want us to see now as we move forward is God made us to function in an inside-out manner. From the inside out. That's how God made us to function. And let me just kind of put this on kind of illustration. First of all, we're made with passions that live in our heart. Our heart is not just a dead place. Now it can become dead. We can kill life. We can kill passion. But God has placed into our heart, he has built into our heart to be filled with passion and desire and loves. What our heart loves, we become. The things that we are passionate about, we move towards. That's the idea. Our heart is full of passion. And then out of that passion of our heart, and this is how we function, guys, out of the heart's passions, we have evaluative thinking. We evaluate things. We use our mind to evaluate things. What are we evaluating? Well, we're evaluating how it is that I can satisfy the longings of my heart. My heart longs to have satisfaction. That's the thing about passion and desire. It longs for satisfaction. So the question is, how can I do that? My mind ponders that question. And then based on that pondering, based on that evaluative thinking, what do? My body makes willful choices. If I have this longing to be satisfied, and here's how my mind tells me I can do it, now my body does what? It steps into action. And it does what? It does what it needs to do to satisfy the longings in my heart. And then out of that comes my emotional reactions in my gut. Based on the level of satisfaction, I feel certain things. Positive things, if I feel like that desire has been satisfied. Negative things, emotions, if I feel like that longing or that desire hasn't been fully satisfied like I want. Now, what I want you to see is that we were all designed to be energized by a heart that is filled with passion that would inform every other aspect of our being. The passions of our heart inform our minds, which inform our body, which informs our emotions. That's how it works. One other thing we're going to talk about next time. Your heart was made to have a ruling passion. In other words, it's not just filled with passions and loves and desires. There will be always one passion that will take precedent over all the other passions. One ruling passion that causes all the other passions, desires, and longings to kind of fall in line around that. And it's that one ruling passion that gives meaning and purpose to all the other passions, then that flow outward into my life, into my mind, my behavior, my emotions. Now, the approaches that deal with sexual temptation by focusing only on my mind or my body, my thinking and my doing, they basically ignore this inside-out process. You see that? What do they ignore specifically? The passions and desires and longings of our heart. Notice, the behavior management approach says if you just believe the right things, you will then be able to choose to do the right thing, right? If you just believe the right thing, then all you got to do is choose the right thing. Maybe the problem is that you're not believing the right thing, and then you're not going to do it. But maybe you believe the right things, but you're just choosing not to do it. So either believe the right thing and then let that happen, choose the right thing, or just try harder to do the right thing, right? That's basically the model. If you really believe God says porn is sin, then just choose not to look at it. And some things that you can help along the way are what? Well, bounce your eyes, exhaust your body, take a cold shower, and shame yourself. Why doesn't this approach work? Well, again, the answer? Because human beings aren't just a brain on a stick. That's how that approach looks at it. If you just know the right thing, then you will what? Do the right thing. And if you're not doing the right thing, then you either don't know it or you don't really believe it. And if you don't really believe it, then the question is, man, maybe you're not even a Christian. You know, you just keep looking at that porn, maybe he says that you're really not even a Christian. And guess who wins there? Yeah, the devil. Guys, we're not brains on a stick. We are relational beings made with powerful passions in our heart. Desires that make me feel fully alive as a man, that long to be satisfied. And these passions then form thoughts in my mind. And what are those thoughts? What I believe will satisfy my desire for the experience of life that I crave. And then out of that, those things shape the choices of my body. What I must do to get the thing I believe will satisfy me and make me feel alive. Because we're always drawn towards life. And we're always going to avoid death. Why? Because the God who made us is a God of life. And because we bear His image, we long for life. Our problem is we just get confused what life is. We often have a different definition of life than God has. That's what gets us in trouble. And then as we make those choices, it produces reactions in my gut, emotional reactions in my gut, how I feel based on my experience of satisfaction. See how this works? And you see how the approach that most of us take to dealing with sexual temptation, that management control approach, is really just views us as brains on a stick instead of relational beings? That we understand ourselves from this inside-out process? Now, if all this is true, if we're not brains on a stick, and if we really are an inside-out being, then trying to defeat sexual temptation by monitoring beliefs and managing behavior without first addressing desires ruling in our heart is going to do what? It's going to be like trying to swim against the current of the ocean. Ever swim in the ocean? Ever swim in Lake Michigan? You get caught in one of those currents? You know, one of the things that I used to scuba dive all the time, and we would scuba dive in Muskegon right off the break wall. And if you weren't careful, you'd come to the surface, and all of a sudden you notice, I'm not moving, but I am. The shore is getting further away. And so you start trying to swim, and you don't move very fast with fins and everything on. You know, you got all your scuba gear, because the current is constantly pulling you out. And a lot of guys get in trouble because of the current. It's like trying to swim against the current in the ocean. We may put forth great effort. We may learn better forms and get stronger, become a stronger swimmer, and we may even make progress for a time. But what happens? In the end, what wins? The current. The current. The overwhelming power of the ocean will always pull us down. In other words, guys, confronting sexual temptation without addressing the passions in our heart will always leave us in that cycle, exhausted, frustrated, defeated. Exhausted, frustrated, defeated. And we're always going to be taking arrows. Listen to what Jesus says in Matthew 23. Beginning in verse 25, he says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you work hard to clean the outside of the cup and the plate, but inside you are full of greed and self-indulgence. You blind Pharisee, first clean what? The inside of the cup and the dish, and then the outside will become clean too." Notice what Jesus is saying here. He's saying two things. First, the most important thing that we as men must attend to in the living of our lives on a daily basis are the desires that are taking place in our heart and not the behavior of our body. You say, well, I shouldn't care about the behavior of my body? Yeah. But if that's all you're caring about, you're going to be a Pharisee. Jesus says the most important thing to take care of is the inside. The passions, desires, and longings that are looking to be satisfied in your heart. And secondly, notice what Jesus says. I love this. He says, if a man rightly attends to the desires of his heart, the external behavior of his body will naturally what? Follow. He says, first clean the inside of the cup, and then the outside of the cup will be clean too. In other words, good passions produce good thoughts, produce good choices, produce good reactions. Proverbs says something similar. Proverbs 4:23, above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. Guard your heart. Why? Everything you do on the outside flows from where? The inside. What is he saying? What is Solomon saying? He says, your heart is like the headwaters of a river. What is the headwaters of a river? It's the source where all the water of the river comes from. Just like the health of a river depends on the purity of its headwater, guess what, guys? So also the health of our spiritual life depends on the purity of our hearts. The passions and longings and desires that are going on inside of them. And he says that if our heart is polluted with bad passions and bad desires, then everything downstream will what? It'll be polluted, it'll suffer and die. But if it is kept clean and if we guard the headwater of our heart, then everything downstream in our minds, in our thoughts, in our bodies, and actions and emotions will thrive and flourish. In other words, what? Good passions produce good thoughts, produce good choices, produce good reactions. Conversely, bad passions produce what? Bad thoughts, which produce bad choices, which produce bad reactions. Now, if that's true, Solomon says it's true, Jesus says it's true, throughout the Bible we see that's true. We live from an inside-out perspective. We're not brains on a stick. What's going to happen if you're dealing with sexual temptation as if you're just a brain on a stick? If I think the right things, then I'll do the right things. If I'm not doing the right things, then I'm not believing it hard enough, or I'm not really believing it. I just got to try harder and do more. What's going to happen? We're going to be on the battlefield, and you're going to look at yourself and you're going to say, man, I'm a pincushion. I'm full of arrows. You'll be taking arrows all the time. You got to start where Jesus says to start, with our heart. Why? Because sexual temptation is aimed, what did we say at the very beginning? At our heart's devotion to God. If we're going to successfully confront sexual temptation, where do we start? We begin with the heart. So then, what do we see today? In summary, what do we see? Well, a couple of things. Sexual temptation must be confronted in the context of the spiritual battle. It's a spiritual arrow. It has spiritual origins. And if we're going to understand it and defend it, we have to use spiritual strategies and weapons, because it's all being fought on a spiritual battlefield. Second, the spiritual battle is currently taking place in the overlap of the ages, the present evil age and the promised new age. The desires and deeds of the flesh are trying to pull my heart that way, while the desires and fruit of the Spirit, God is wanting me to lean into this. And the arrows of temptation are trying to get us to ignore the present or the promised new age and stay stuck in where? The present evil age. It's in the overlap of the ages that the battle is being fought for our heart's devotion. Not our behavior, but our heart. Why our heart? Because whatever has your heart will also have your behavior. The aim of sexual temptation is to turn our heart's devotion back towards this present evil age characterized by desires and deeds of the flesh. What is the flesh? The flesh is a virus. It is an allergy towards God. It's like that magnet of putting both ends together. It just constantly turns us away from God and the things of God. That's the flesh. Given both the aim of sexual temptation as well as our inside-out design, how God made us to function, sexual temptation must be confronted by focusing primarily on our heart's desires. And lastly, we saw that confronting temptation by only focusing on managing behavior is like trying to swim against the unrelenting currents of the ocean. It might work for a while, but in the end, we're not going to win. We're going to get exhausted, frustrated, and defeated. Guys, is there a better way? Is there a better way than just trying to work harder and do more? Well, I think there is. And if all this is true, then to defeat sexual temptation, we really need to understand and know and grasp three things. Number one, what are the passions in my heart right now that have taken space in my heart that make me susceptible to sexual temptation? You know, what I find most often we're not even aware of those passions. those desires, those loves. We think they're something, but they're often something very different than what we believe. We got to know what those passions are. Because if we don't, we're going to be susceptible. Second, we have to ask the question, why do those particular passions make me susceptible to sexual temptation? What is it about those loves and passions and longings in my heart that make me right now susceptible to sexual temptation? Maybe those loves and passions might not make Joe susceptible to sexual temptation, but why do they make me susceptible to sexual temptation? Why? Because that'll be true. What makes you susceptible to temptation won't make me. And it has to do with the different passions and desires in our heart. Why those? And thirdly, how did those passions come to take space in my heart? How did they get there in the first place? And what can I do about them? 3 key things to understand if we're going to guard our hearts, if we're going to take up the shield of faith and turn away the fiery darts of the evil one. If not, we might fend them off for a while, but it's just a matter of time, because he is unrelenting in his pursuit to steal our hearts away from God. So we'll talk about this next time. And guys, December we're taking off a little later, and things get busy in December. And so we will be picking up again January 11th, 2025. You believe 2025 already? I still remember when it was 2020 or 2000, and everybody's, are the computers going to work anymore? Is the world going to fall off the cliff? And we're going to look at sexual temptation, part 3, overcoming sexual temptation by changing the desires of our hearts. We're going to look at the desires, we're going to see why they're there, and we're going to see, is there a way to change my heart's desires by learning to reshape the contour of my heart? That's what we're going to talk about. So until then, guys, good to see you again, and take care. We'll see you in the next year.